Chapter 5 is entitled The Perceptual Context. And what we're talking about here can be seen from this graphic. We started at the outside layer, cultural context. Microcultural context was the next layer. And in the previous chapter, we talked about the environmental context. And what we were saying in that chapter was the environment in which a conversation takes place has some effect on how that conversation goes. Well, there are other elements as well that are important in affecting the nature of that conversation. And one of those is how we perceive the other person. So that's the general topic for this chapter. And what that gets us into this concept of perception is, first of all, kind of cognition and culture, so how we perceive the world. And part of the what's involved in perception as well is how we put things and people into categories. And so we're going to be talking about that in this chapter, and that leads us as well to the concept of stereotyping. And so that's a topic that we're going to be looking at as well. So the perceptual context, what we're dealing with here is perception. It deals with how we take in, store, and retrieve information. This is something obviously that's not culturally determined in the sense that it's universal, but how, in fact, that process takes place is culturally different. And that's one of the principal things we're going to be looking at in this chapter. So what that provides us is kind of a starting point, namely the perceptions that we have. That's part of what gives us the starting point for a frame of reference in the conversation that we're having with another person. Gerhard Hofstede coined this idea of culture being the software of the mind, and what he meant by that is that we're not born with cultural information or the values and beliefs and behaviors that we acquire through our culture, but it's something that we gradually acquire. It's a little bit misleading maybe to think of it as programming. It's not something that you get all at once. It's something that you get gradually. Same objects are perceived differently as a result of cultural values and beliefs. And we're going to look at an example of that where we're talking about the same thing, two different things actually, and the perceptions of those are quite different in two different cultures. And the cultures we're going to be looking at in this example are the United States and India. And this is taken from the film Outsourced. So let's take a look at that clip and then we'll talk about it briefly.
Okay, what else? Yes, man meat.
I do not understand item H403.
H403. Yeah, a lot of Americans wear these to sporting events.
But why, sir?
It's hard to explain. We just do. Yes.
I don't understand the purpose of A221.
A221. That's a burger brand. Americans eat a lot of beef, and some people like to burn their initials into their food with a red-hot iron before they eat it.
Why?
It's like a cattle brand. You know, the thing you use to burn a symbol into a cow with? No, in America, that's how you keep track of your cow, is branding.
With a red hot iron.
Yeah.
But wouldn't the cow run away?
Oh, no, we only do it to baby cows. When they're, small enough to hold them down.
The context of this clip is that it's a call center in India. These are workers who are learning about the products that they're selling from a catalog. And one of these novelty products is a piece of plastic that's yellow. And this is a very culturally bound product. You have to know about Wisconsin as a dairy state. You have to know that there are enthusiastic sports fans there who to show their loyalty to a Wisconsin team, like the Green Bay Packers, will put this piece of plastic on their head when they go to a game. The interesting, I think, object in that clip was the cow and how differently a cow is perceived in the United States and in India. In the United States, we see that as an object that lives on the farm, gives milk, and that we use to produce steaks and hamburgers. Very different view in India for Hindus. A cow is sacred. You certainly don't brand a cow. You don't eat the cow. Beef is not eaten by Hindus at all. So it's a example of how the same object can be perceived very differently in different cultures in different parts of the world. The difference between perception of Westerners in general and Asians was discussed in the text, and I think interesting examples there of how we in the West tend to look for similarities and differences. That's how we tend to group objects together, whether they're alike or different, and how in Asia it's more likely that people look at relationships. And there were interesting examples there in the text given of fish in a tank and images of three images of cow, a cow, chicken, and grass, and how that's interpreted differently in different cultures. So the first stage, when we're talking about perception, the first stage is some kind of stimulus, like hearing something, or in this case, seeing a picture, and then interpreting that. And when we have this external stimulus, what happens is that there are different filters that affect how we interpret that stimulus. The first of those is the physiological filter. So if we don't see very well, we don't hear very well, that's going to affect, obviously, our interpretation of that stimulus. Also, if our membership in a particular group may affect how we perceive something, as well as our attitudes and beliefs, our kind of individual perspective on the world. And there were some examples given in the text of how the same external stimulus could have very different responses. Rap music, young people like it, old people don't. So there's kind of a sociological distinction there. If you listen to the same speech, your reaction might be quite different depending on your political orientation. And we're going to talk about differences in cross-cultural perception. And the first of those is that the physical environment may have some effect, different physical environments in different countries and within countries. So if you live and work in a loud environment, you might you suffer hearing loss. For example, if you live in New York City, you live on a farm in the middle of Africa, it's going to be your hearing's probably going to be better. Interesting example given in the text of African miners, example of indirect environmental conditions affecting perception, genetic differences as well, and a general difference sometimes in which sense is favored, namely the Europeans favoring visual stimuli and the Africans leaning more towards auditory. Interesting idea there in terms of cultural contrast is this idea that we in the West, if you live surrounded by, as people in the West do, in buildings that are rectangles and have right angles, that we tend to see the world that way. We try to shape things that we see in those patterns. And so we see things like that, which may not be true in other parts of the world. We saw, for example, in Africa, or the case of the Navajo Hogan in African villages. Often the houses are round and not rectilinear. Stage 2 after input is memory, and we distinguish there short-term memory, long-term memory. Short-term memory is very limited. Most scholars say that this is the number of things you can retain in short-term memory, and short-term memory is also can be very short-term. Sometimes people say as limited as 30 seconds. May be affected by what writing system we use. So if we use the Latin alphabet versus Chinese characters. The example is given there of the distinction there in terms of short-term memory. In terms of long-term memory, there are different kinds of long-term memory that are discussed in the text. One of the interesting things in terms of episodic long-term memory is the fact that Asians tend to have different long-term memories than people in the West who tend to remember things that happen to them individually, whereas in Asia it tends to be memories that affect groups, kind of points to the individualistic versus collectivistic cultures, distinction in cultures. And we have semantic memory, which refers to how we conceive the world and how we use language. Then procedural memory, for example, riding a bike, how to do something. Then the third stage, so input and memory, and the third stage is retrieval of the memory, recall. Long-term memory capacity is not limited like short-term memory, but it is affected by various things. Interference, so bringing in new information can force old information to leave. Anxiety, if we're nervous about something, then we tend to have difficulties with memory. Unpleasant memories are often repressed, and then also, of course, age has an effect on our ability to remember. One of the interesting aspects of memory that's been looked at quite a bit, and I'm going to show you an image on the next slide. It's taken from an article in National Geographic about memory, and references a technique that is actually used by people who participate in these memory contests and who are successful in these memory contests. And this memory concept, this memory technique is called the memory palace. And it's a very interesting technique. The idea is that you make associations with things that you want to remember. And one of the ways that you can do that is that you have a particular building in mind, something that you know well or that you can imagine very well, a house or a palace or some kind of other structure, and kind of you walk your way through that building in your mind. So the steps in using the memory palace is, first you choose a house or a palace or whatever it is, a museum, something that you know well. And then the things that you want to remember, you associate with parts of that building. So as you walk in, there might be an entrance hall, and so there might be a table there with a lamp on it. So you associate something that you want to remember with that lamp, or maybe with that table. And what you see in this graphic here is how professional memory contest winners go about remembering the order of a deck of cards. And they're able to memorize that order in very quickly. And the way that's typically done is they might remember the cards in groups of three. So this first group is an ace of spades, looks like a queen of clubs, and a nine of hearts as spades. Can't tell. It's kind of hard to read, but the association that's made there is the ace of spades, starting with A, is made with Arnold Schwarzenegger lifting something. The queen there, the association is Paris Hilton dancing. The nine looks a little bit like a car. And so those three cards put together, you have the image of Arnold Schwarzenegger dancing with a car. Now, this is a very strange kind of image, but what's been discovered in terms of mnemonic devices is the stranger the combination, the easier it is to remember. And so this is a technique that has been used going back to the ancient Greeks. There are lots of other memory devices that are out there, some that are used in language learning. If you learn French, you probably learned Mrs. Van der Tramp. Each letter in her name stands for a different verb that is conjugated with the verb être. Monter, rester, sortir, the first three, and then the others. Then you have, that's the acronym approach. The acrostic, you have something like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, where each of the first letters of those words stand for the sequence in solving math equations. You have the keyword method that's used in language learning. So if you want to remember what the word barrister means, which is a lawyer, it sounds like the word bear. So this is a person that acts like a bear in court. Then you have this idea of spaced repetition. It's based on the forgetting curve, which is something that's recognized in psychology, that there is a pattern for how people learn and how we forget. And the idea here is that if you want to learn, for example, vocabulary, it's better, rather than working with a list or a set of flashcards every single day, it's better to start one day, work on a set, say a set of vocabulary, and then wait 3 days and review it again, and then wait another 7 days. In other words, there's a sequence that's optimal for keeping those things in memory. And there are a number of software programs out there. If you look at flashcard programs that are out on the web, there are a number of those. A number of them have this kind of spaced repetition built into them. The next topic that we're going to be dealing with in this chapter is categorization, which is related to stereotyping. Categorization is something that that's done universally in all categories, and what we're talking about is just grouping, sorting, classifying objects, people, living things, according to what we perceive to be their similarities. And stereotyping, we'll talk about in the next presentation, is associated with when we associate particular traits and behaviors with categories of people. We all use categorization to make sense of the world. When we see something, we put it together with things that we perceive as being similar. It's how we understand the world. And we do this with objects, we do this with animals, even with ideas, and we do it with people as well. And when we see people, we tend to look at the external appearance. So that's important in putting that person in a particular category. Their appearance, their dress, their hair, their skin color, all those things are used to put people in categories. And this is done in all cultures. It's done a little bit differently in the West and in Asia. We talked about that already. The fact that in Asia, categories are seen based on relationships and based on the environment. So don't tend to separate objects apart from their environment, but things are seen in context. Whereas in the West, we use analytical categories, so we don't necessarily look at the context, we look at how things are similar or different. And there are pluses and minuses to using categories. As we said, this is something that's universal. It's not necessarily something that's bad. It helps to make sense of the world. It puts things into manageable size. It helps us recall information. So in that sense, it reduces uncertainty and stress. And it may help us to link our culture with others because we perceive things in the same way. But that has downsides as well, because of the fact that that it kind of emphasizes in-group differences and how our in-group is different from people outside our group, out-groups, and that can lead to discrimination and bias. It also, obviously, when we put people into categories, it ignores individual difference. So we'll stop at this point for this first presentation, and we'll talk about stereotypes then in the second presentation.